Hey everyone, this is Mel Clemente and I'm excited to present to you today's webinar where I'll talk about our recent releases in FormsViewer and FormsDesigner. We've done this kind of webinar back in July last year and there had been a lot of changes and improvements since then. We're now on version 9.1 in FormsViewer and 3.1.3 in FormsDesigner. You may visit our release notes pages for a detailed list of what had changed in the earlier versions, but for now, for today's webinar, we'll focus on these key features from our recent releases. We'll go through each one of these items during our live demo soon. To get to the release notes page, just head over to your FormsViewer homepage and click on the release notes link. Here's a quick glimpse of the detailed changes, improvements, and bug fixes in version 9.1. To see the FormsDesigner version history, just click on the top right menu in FormsDesigner and then select FormsDesigner, the About To section, and you'll see a detailed list of changes for each version release. For starters, we now support all data types for adding into your Forms main data source. We've got support for text, numbers, Boolean, date and time, picture attachments or file attachments, person types, and URLs. All of these can now be added into your main data source. And in order to display these data into your forms, among the other already supported controls in FormsDesigner, we now have the rich text box, calculated value, and picture attachment. We'll show you adding these controls in a sample form during the demo. You also have more control settings for things like margins, paddings, widths, among others that you can customize your form according to your needs. And of course, we're continuing to fix bugs and make improvements to help you design your forms as easy and efficient as possible. Next, we've got a couple improvements to FormsViewer, which are mostly based on customer feedbacks. You ask, we listen. Starting with the improvement to the upload template page, two of our customers actually asked for this. You can now see the more information icon on the upload template page. If you click on it, you're going to see the file name, version, the timestamp, date timestamp, so when it was last updated and who last updated it. This comes handy so you won't have to go back to the templates page to check for the template details. And now for the view name tracking, we can now make use of the current and the previous attributes in the Qdabra rules data source for storing the name of the view that the user goes to. Here's a snippet of our demo form where we capture the current and the previous views. The most common use case for this is when your form has a bunch of views and you'll have buttons for navigating to the previous and the next views. You might have nav tabs or buttons. To go back to the previous view, you'd make use of the set default view command and then pass the parameter, the previous value, the attribute's value as the view to switch back to. I also imagine an agreement page where you'd have a view for terms and conditions, for example, and you'd like to keep track and make sure that the user actually viewed the page and then submit and store that activity somewhere like a list. You can be creative and think of other scenarios where it can be useful. Up next, hyperlinks. If you have links inside a rich text box that is read-only, you're able to click on it now and it would open a new tab in your browser to take you to that URL. They're stored as plain text before that weren't clickable, so that's a nice addition. And last but not the least, in our key changes in this release is the addition of the new timeout parameter for the MakeRequest command. This command allows you to make network requests such as executing API queries to connect to, for example, OpenAI to utilize ChatGPT's AI features, to Google's API services for things like translation and GPS tracking. In this snippet, you'll see that we're connecting to Microsoft Graph to get the list of groups. So sometimes these requests take time to return results. So now we have a timeout parameter that allows you to specify the amount of time in milliseconds. The request will terminate if it takes longer than this amount of time to complete. Here we're showing an error message informing the user so. All right, let's actually show you these samples working in live demos. So here we are in our FormsViewer homepage. I'm going to click on Manage Templates and head over to our webinar demo form. And here we'll see the improvement to the upload template page that we talked about earlier. There's the new eye icon, and we'll see more information. There's our file name, the form version, when it was last updated, the date and timestamp, and who last updated it. We plan on improving this further by showing a version history so we can keep track of the changes that happen throughout this form template. For now, let's go ahead and open a form. So we've built this for one of our customers, and I customized it for the purposes of this webinar. The first thing you'll notice are the vertical tabs here. Each of these buttons will switch us to the view it corresponds to. On the upper right corner here, we'll see the current view and the previous view. These are the Qdabra rules attributes. And right now you're seeing we're on part 1. Previously we're on part 0, which was the main view. And if I click on the part 2 button here, we'll get switched to the part 2 view, and the key rules attributes would show us that. Same goes when I click on the next and the previous button. We'll see how those attributes change the value as they're stored. One interesting scenario would be this go back button. So right now I'm on part 3. I can switch to the main tab, for example. This switches us to the part 0 view where I don't have that go back button. But if I go to part 5, now I see the go back button. Click on it and it'll take me back to the main view where I was. So let's do it again, part 1 here and then part 5. Click on go back, switches me back to part 1, and I can click on it again, and now I'm back on part 5. So you can actually use this this button. This is the one that is making use of the set default view command and leverages the previous view attribute in key rules. So that's view tracking, and now we'll show you that all data types are now available for adding into your form's main data source. Here in our form, I've added the controls for all the data types in InfoPath, and later on we're going to add the same controls in FormsDesigner. For now, let's fill out this form so you can see how the data types and their corresponding controls work in FormsViewer. So I'm just typing something here. Let's add some formatting to these texts. Make this bold. This one, make it let's see, a heading or something. That's how a rich text box looks. Next, the calculated value. This uses the now function. And the picture attachment, I'm just going to choose a file from my machine here. Here's our logo. Right. Now a checkbox, check and uncheck this guy right here. Date picker, I'm just going to select a date here. A drop-down list with some options. Let's select the first one. Then option buttons, we've got 3 options here. And a text box, of course, the most common control used in these forms. File attachment this time, I'm going to select a file from my machine. I'll grab the Central Flows XTP maybe. Okay. Next is the person picker. I've added 3 types here. Let's start with the normal person picker where I can select a user from our organization. Click OK, and that works nicely. Now for the group picker, I should be able to select a group this time. Let's try searching for test. I'm going to select test members, okay. And there's our group right there. For multiple person pickers, it's the same except it will allow us to add more than just one user in this control. I'm going to pick Patrick. And then add myself. All right, let's also add Hillary. Okay, now we have multiple persons in that control. Looking good so far. You've seen how the stock InfoPath controls work with each data type. Now let's head back over to our template page and open our template in FormsDesigner by clicking on the Design button on the far right here. Here's how our canvas looks like. Let's switch to part 5, which is the view we just filled out. Here's the section where I've added those controls. Let me just show you real quick the Qdabra rules view attributes that we talked about. Here's the current and the previous attributes. This is where you can access these from. Add rules in your form depending on your requirements. Just how I demoed view tracking earlier. Let's move along and start adding controls from within FormsDesigner. These are the 3 controls that we recently added in this release. We've got rich text box, calculated value, and picture attachment. Let's start adding the rich text box. So select the control from the Add Controls menu and then select Rich Text Box. Click on the plus sign. We need to bind it to a field in our form. My rich text box field is already selected. Click Done, and now we'll see the control added to our canvas. Here in our control properties pane, we'll see some options so we can further customize our control. I'm going to make this read-only so I can demo the clickable hyperlinks feature. That's also one of the changes in this release. Next, we'll add a calculated value. Let's place our cursor here in this row and then select the control from our menu. Click on the plus sign. There's our calculated value. Let's select it so we can specify the formula for it. So I clicked on the formula box. I'd like to show the time in this calculated value control, so I'll use a formula that is a combination of the substring after and the now functions. Everything after t in the now output will give us the time. All right. Next, we'll add the picture attachment control, so let's do the same for the rest of the controls here. Select the picture attachment field from my main data source. There it goes. Next, the checkbox. Bind it to the checkbox field. Click Done. Now the date picker, same thing. Bind it to the date picker field. Now for the drop down, after adding and binding the control, we can specify the list options by clicking Edit Choices in the control properties. Click Add New. I'd like a blank option by default, so I'll just set the display name to Select Option and leave the value blank. Click Done. Let me go ahead and add a new one. Let's do Option 1 for the display name and assign it to a value of 1. Add another one. Let's go with Option 2 with the value of 2. And lastly, Option 3. We can also sort these options by clicking on the down or the up arrow keys to specify their order. Let's switch these back to the right order. And click Done. Now let's add option buttons. Place my cursor in this row and select option buttons from the controls menu. Bind it to the field in my main data source again. Click Done. We'll see that it's asking me to specify the number of option buttons to insert. Let's do 2 this time with a yes and no. Next, text box, again the most common control used in a form. Then file attachment. Now person picker. We've got 3 types here. Let's start with the regular person picker. When adding a person picker control, make sure to bind it to the actual person group, like so. Let's show you adding the group picker this time. select the actual group picker field. Now, if we select this control, we'll see in the properties that we have some options. If I select people and groups, users will be allowed to select groups for this control. We're going to do the same for this multiple person picker. I'll add a person picker control first, bind it to the correct field. And if I click on it, I can check this box so that users can pick multiple persons. And that's it for adding the controls in FormsDesigner. Let's save our changes. And then let's open a new form to see how our changes look like. Here's our form again. Let's go to part 5, which is our demo view. Here's how our changes look like. Looks good to me. Let's start filling it out again. This time in the rich text box, I'd like to enter a hyperlink. It's going to be the URL to our website, Qdabra.com, so I can demo the clickable hyperlinks in a read-only rich text box feature. Recall that we made this rich text box read-only when we designed it earlier. Now if I click on the link here, it's going to open a new tab and take me to the URL, like so. Great. Now for the calculated value, here's where we specified the formula to return just the current time. Next, I'll select our logo again for the picture attachment. Looks good. Here's our checkbox. And our date picker. Our drop-down list box with the options we specified. We see that we have different options for these two drop-downs. Then our option buttons with just the yes and no options. Our text box. File attachment, I'm going to add the Central Flows XTP again. Alright, then let's fill out the person picker controls for the regular one, just selecting myself. Group picker, let's select our core team this time. Now the multiple person picker control, selecting Patrick here again. And then myself. That's about it for the recent changes in FormsDesigner on data types and controls. For the last but not the least piece in our demo, let's switch to part 6 here where we have the MakeRequest command setup. We've added this new timeout parameter in the recent release like we mentioned earlier. But to show you how this works, let me first click on Get Groups. The form will make a request through the Microsoft Graph API to get the current groups that I belong to. Here's that list. It provided results in just a short amount of time, about a second or two. But to simulate timeouts, let's specify the timeout parameter to just 1 millisecond, and then click on this button to get the groups. You'll see that we got an error. That's because we forced the request to terminate if no results had returned during that duration. I'll close that error message and we'll see that there are no results returned. Here's the command syntax that had run. There's a path to our request endpoint, Microsoft Graph to get the list of groups with these columns, return only the top 50 items. We've got the method and the header as well, and here's our timeout parameter that we specified. That's it for our demo. I hope that all made sense to you. Do watch out for more releases as we continue to improve Qdabra Forms. As always, thank you for being here. Have a great day.